This time we will compare the Samsung Galaxy S20 with my good old Galaxy S4. At the time the S4 offered one of the best camera performance of any phone, so I am curious to see what the differences and improvements we got from couple of generations and the 7-year gap between the two flagship Samsung phones. I'll try to be not too hard on the older phone, because ultimately the first M Galaxy comparison was actually with the Galaxy S4 back in 2015. And don't worry, I know the phone looks kind of beat up, but the camera is perfectly fine, so it won't affect the comparison. By the way, who remembers that? So starting with the first picture of this BMW's hood, both came out looking really good. Though we have tad more information in the highlights and shadows coming from the Galaxy S20. Especially pay attention to the sunset in the background. The similar difference over here, probably something between the two would be ideal. The S4 came out looking a little bit more natural, but also a bit overexposed in the upper left side of the picture. I would lean towards the S20 only if the colors of the sky were a bit more natural. The reason why the Galaxy S4 sometimes blows highlights and shadow is that it doesn't have Auto HDR. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this feature was introduced with the Galaxy S6 for the first time. Of course, you can manually select the Hdr Mode on, but it's still something much more different that we know from today, both in terms of the results and ease of use. So without the use of HDR, the S4's pictures are also a little bit darker often. In this scenario, the S4 actually came out looking pretty decent, but you will often find that extra brightness to be useful. Like in this one, you can see the type of watch that I'm wearing perfectly on the S20, whereas on the S4 it looks sort of like a one big mess. I also want you to notice a bit more shallow depth of field in the S20 thanks to the slightly bigger sensor and faster aperture. And like I said, you could also use the dedicated HDR mode on the Galaxy S4. In order to do that, you have to select the HDR mode, hold your phone steadily and wait till the processing is finished. Not on par with today's Auto HDR algorithms, but it gets job done somewhat. Actually, the picture came out looking better than I thought it would be, but as you see, the S20 is a bit more refined. By the way, I should also mention that I found the S20's HDR to be slightly downgraded from the Galaxy S10. If you want to know more about the difference between those two, check out my S20 versus S10 comparison. Anyway, we also can't forget the S20 comes with two extra modules, telephoto and ultra-wide angle. And just so you can see the difference in the field of view when using the latter, whereas I don't really use zoom that much, I find that ultra-wide lens to be very useful and fun to use feature. Taking a look at the level of detail, I think the most noticeable difference is when shooting scenes with large amount of information. In other words, with a lot of the things going on, like for example landscapes. Going into the crop reveals the S20 provides with tad more nuances, definition and sharpness in comparison with the older Galaxy. Just look at the farther area of this field. Moving to some macros, the difference becomes harder to tell, to be honest. In this Lemons picture you can notice the S20 is tad sharper, but I would say the overall level of detail between the two stays fairly similar. Here I also want you to notice the major flaw of this year's Galaxy, which are the optical distortions. Just look at the left upper side of this picture. Other than that, the S20 is brighter, but generally both look great, with pleasing colors. Aside from that, surprisingly in the crop looks like the S4 provided a little bit more details this time. The S20's HDR was once again quite handy. The S4 looks a bit overexposed, although the color of this black plastic came out more natural. The S20 adds a bit more sharpness, but the level of detail looks to be about the same. Extremely comparable here, both have very nice and vibrant colors, and I must say I'm totally amazed by how good the Galaxy S4 can hold up in terms of the detail level with the newer phone. But don't expect the S4 to always catch up with the white balance or colors. Taking many pictures in a lot of different conditions reveals weaknesses of the old phone. The newer one is usually more reliable and predictable. Now let's take a look at the video quality. So probably the biggest difference is that the Galaxy S20 can record in 4K, even 8K, but that's whole another topic, whereas the old Galaxy is able to record at a maximum of 1080p at 30 frames per second. Having higher resolution, you can definitely notice more details and sharpness. Apart from that, I can also see the big upgrades in autofocus, stabilization, bitrate and dynamic range. To be honest, in comparison, the S4's footage is a bit painful to watch. But all the things aside, accounting the 7-year difference, the level of detail when shooting at 1080p is unfortunately disappointingly close, though that's in favor of the Galaxy S4. Speaking of the low-light performance, the lack of Auto HDR still has very significant impact. As you can see in this shot, the S20's picture is not only brighter, but the color tones of the sunset came out looking much more pronounced. And as I said, keep in mind this year's Galaxy HDR was a bit downgraded. Even a bigger difference in this shot. The S20 just wins hands down, no argue with that. Low-light pictures from the S4 often came out looking a little blurry because the autofocus is not on par with today's standards. It has hard time focusing, especially with those kind of lighting conditions. Going into the magnification, the level of noise is also significantly higher than in the S20. In this picture you can even notice a bit of chroma noise from the old Galaxy, although obviously the newer one applies heavy noise reduction to deal with the noise, and as the result there is some lots of detail. But man, just look at the S4, the S20 looks noticeably better. That said, I have to say I was still pretty impressed the S4 was able to capture anything at all really, in those kind of difficult conditions. Over the last few years there seemed to be a big boom in terms of night mode. Brands like Huawei, Google, Apple or Samsung are competing in improvements of this mode to offer the best performance. But truthfully, the Galaxy S4 offered night mode before it became popular. Though, as you can probably imagine, it's not really a night mode we know from the newer phones. The Galaxy S20 is vastly improved when it comes to the low light performance. So in the end, I think it's hard to argue that the smartphone game hasn't stepped up quite a bit since 2013. The newer phone has better autofocus, 2 extra camera modules, better low light performance, better video quality, not to mention important features like Auto HDR and real night mode. Although honestly, I was extremely surprised by the S4's ability to keep up with the newer phone when it comes to the level of detail in daytime pictures. It seems like there is a room for a lot of improvements, Samsung. But let me know how you think the Galaxy S4 held up in this comparison. Consider watching my other videos. See you in the next one. Peace.